Look at the 20 most profitable industries in the United States. Then look at the 20 least profitable. You will see software publishing, pharmaceuticals, branded beverages, and tobacco predictably clustered at the top. At the bottom, you will find airlines, commodity steel, agriculture, and traditional retail. This chart shows the profit margins for these groups over a multi-decade timeline. The lines remain flat and stable. The high-margin industries stay highly profitable year after year, while the low-margin group rarely breaks out of the bottom tier. Down at the bottom, massive operations with thousands of employees and billions in capital equipment struggle simply to break even. The firms at the top do not magically recruit vastly superior managers compared to the firms at the bottom. The executives running a steel mill are actively optimizing highly complex supply chains and daily production schedules, yet their financial returns remain constrained. The variance in returns across different industries is significantly larger than the differences between competing firms within the same industry. The economic environment you choose to compete in dictates your baseline returns far more than how hard you execute your daily operations. In the 1950s, a Berkeley economist named Joe S. Bain set out to explain this discrepancy. He bypassed the elegant, purely theoretical models of perfect competition and instead compiled massive sets of hard empirical data on manufacturing concentration and profit rates. Bain was observing a mid-20th century American economy that rarely matched textbook monopolies or perfectly competitive free markets. Instead, it was populated by oligopolies, industries dominated by a small handful of large firms. To explain how these firms generated their returns, he built a three-part causal chain. It starts with the underlying structure of an industry, which dictates the conduct of the firms within it, which ultimately determines their financial performance. Highly concentrated structures protected by high barriers naturally foster tacit coordination among the players. That predictable conduct yields elevated, supernormal profits. Conversely, highly fragmented structures with low barriers produce aggressive rivalry. Firms constantly undercut one another, driving their collective returns straight down to the baseline cost of capital. In a free market, elevated returns attract new entrants who compete those profits away. Bain proved that specific structural elements act as dams against this erosion, allowing incumbents to capture permanent returns known as Bainian rents. Bain identified 4 specific structural walls, barriers to entry, that protect an industry's profit zone by keeping new competitors out. The first barrier is economies of scale. When the minimum efficient size of a factory is enormous relative to total market demand, an entrant faces a paralyzing choice. They can enter small and operate at a severe cost disadvantage, or build a massive facility and flood the market with so much new supply that prices crash for everyone. Commercial aircraft manufacturing illustrates this. The capital required for a single efficient assembly line is staggering, and running below full capacity guarantees severe financial losses. The second barrier is product differentiation. Accumulated brand investment and customer loyalty operate as a rigid, industry-wide wall against newcomers. Look at the consumer beverage industry. Incumbents have spent decades saturating the market with advertising, permanently shaping how consumers mentally categorize a soft drink. A new beverage company cannot simply formulate a better-tasting liquid and expect to win. They are forced to spend massive amounts of marketing capital to break through decades of historical psychological conditioning. Both scale economies and differentiation exert a heavy structural gravity. They aggressively punish new capital that attempts to enter the system and compete. The third barrier is absolute cost advantages. Proprietary technology, enforced patents, or exclusive access to a scarce natural resource give incumbents a mathematical edge. Entrants cannot match their baseline production costs, regardless of how large a factory they build. The fourth barrier is the sheer capital requirement to play the game. Certain industries remain closed off simply because the upfront financial ante is astronomical. National telecommunications infrastructure is a prime example. Before selling a single cell plan, you must purchase spectrum rights and construct thousands of transmission towers. Capital markets act as the ultimate gatekeepers. Even if a startup presents a flawless business plan, investors will rarely finance an unproven entrant when the initial build-out costs billions, and the downside of failure is a total loss. Scale, differentiation, absolute cost advantages, and capital requirements. Together, these elements insulate incumbents from the continuous threat of creative destruction. They operate as invisible, mechanical filters, separating the persistent, high-profit winners from the break-even players struggling at the bottom of the economy. Bain developed this framework to guide antitrust policy and understand macroeconomics. Decades later, his concepts were translated into the most widely used tool in corporate strategy history. If you step into any modern business school, you will be taught Michael Porter's 5 Forces framework. But Porter didn't invent the underlying mechanics of this model. He took Bain's economic structure and inverted it. The difference is entirely in the motive. Bain looked at these structural barriers and asked how public policy should regulate them to protect consumers. Porter looked at the exact same variables and asked how a manager could exploit them to protect corporate profits. Even Porter's generic strategies, like cost leadership or distinct differentiation, are ultimately executive decisions about which specific Bainian barrier a firm will build its fortress behind. Treating the 5 forces as a static checklist without understanding the mechanics of the structure, conduct, performance engine guarantees a superficial analysis, and usually strategic failure. This structural model is powerful, but economists from the Chicago School raised a serious critique. They argued that a highly concentrated industry doesn't necessarily prove the firms are colluding to keep prices high. It might just prove that those few dominant firms are vastly more efficient than everyone else. Later economists introduced the new industrial organization, noting that firms do not passively inherit their industry structure. Instead, they actively deploy capital to build and reinforce these barriers themselves, shaping the environment to their advantage. But the most critical refinement to pure structural determinism comes from the empirical data on actual firm profitability. This chart breaks down the variance in firm profitability. The data shows that firm-specific effects, the unique internal capabilities and decisions of a single company, drive differences in profit by a factor of roughly 3 to 1 compared to broader industry effects. This means exceptional operational execution and unique resource management can still generate massive profits, even if you are competing in a mathematically terrible industry structure. The inverse is also true. You can secure a position inside a highly protected, structurally attractive oligopoly, and poor internal execution will still destroy your firm. Industry structure sets the baseline gravity for your margins, but it is not destiny. How you position and run the firm within that structure ultimately dictates your survival. To build a complete, accurate picture of competitive advantage, a strategist has to combine 3 distinct economic lenses. We bring together the structural analysis of Bain, the resource-based differentiation of Chamberlin, and the creative destruction of Schumpeter into a unified framework. Apply this triad to a pharmaceutical company. First, the firm relies on the Bainian element, an industry characterized by high capital requirements and heavy regulatory barriers that consistently deter new entrants. Next, it relies on Chamberlinian elements. The company leverages its heterogeneous internal resources, like the accumulated brand trust and distribution networks it has built with practicing physicians over decades. Finally, the Schumpeterian element. The company captures the explosive profit window created by a new, patented drug discovery, knowing they must harvest those returns before the inevitable wave of creative destruction resets the market. A firm that relies on only one of these rent-generating mechanisms is highly vulnerable. True durable advantage requires mastering all 3. The ultimate task of the strategist is to engineer a structural and operational architecture that systematically protects the firm from the relentless, profit-destroying gravity of perfect competition.